There was a group, completely erased from history, not forgotten, erased. And what they discovered might change how you understand reality. There are truths so dangerous that they are vibration capable of shaping human emotion. And perhaps most dangerously of all, especially within institutions built on unquestioned authority, does not tolerate being challenged. The church did not fear ignorance. Ignorance could be guided, shaped, protected. What it feared was knowledge that existed outside its control. Knowledge that could not be filtered through doctrine. Knowledge that did not ask for permission to exist. And the Watchers had crossed that line. They were not heretics in the way history typically remembers. They did not openly defy God. They did not preach rebellion or chaos. Instead, they did something far more dangerous. They sought to understand creation without mediation, without interpretation, without the church standing between them and the truth. And for that, they were not simply condemned. They were erased. No trials were recorded. No names were preserved. No official accusations survive. There are no graves, no confessions, no martyrdom, just silence. A perfect and total absence where something should have been. But silence like that is never empty. It lingers, it echoes, and sometimes, if you look closely enough, it begins to reveal the shape of what was removed. Because something did survive. Not the whole truth. Not even close. But fragments. Anomalies. Small inconsistencies scattered across time like pieces of something that was never meant to be reassembled. A torn page hidden where no it gets removed completely and irreversibly, not just the people, but the knowledge itself. here. And that raises a question that becomes harder to ignore the deeper you look. If they were wrong, why go to such lengths to remove every trace of their existence? And if they were right, what exactly was so dangerous about what they discovered that it could not be allowed to survive? Tonight we begin with the fragments, with the pieces that remain scattered and incomplete, and we follow them as far as they will take us. Not into myth, not into speculation, but into a reconstruction of something that once existed and was deliberately taken apart. Because the truth about the watches is not something that was preserved, it is something that must be rebuilt. And as we begin to put those pieces together, one thing becomes increasingly clear. This is not just a story about the past. It is a story about something that was never meant to be known. And it begins with a discovery that should not exist. The monastery was never meant to be found by accident. Even today, reaching it requires intention. A deliberate departure from the paths most travelers take. A slow ascent into a landscape that seems to resist human presence. It sits high in the Alps. Built for isolation rather than grandeur. Narrow corridors, low ceilings, small windows. Noticeable. A thin line running through the masonry, something that could have been dismissed as natural wear. But over time, that line widened, deepened, until eventually, a portion of the wall gave way. Not completely, just enough. Enough to reveal darkness behind it. The workers who were called in to repair it were not historians. They were not looking for secrets. They were there to restore structure, to reinforce what time had begun to erode. And yet, the moment the stone shifted, the moment that gap opened, just slightly wider than expected, something changed. Because the wall was thicker than it should have been. And behind it, there was space. At first it seemed insignificant. A cavity, perhaps the result of earlier construction, a void. Left unintentionally, something that could be filled and sealed without further thought. But as more stone was carefully removed, that assumption became harder to maintain. The space was too precise, too contained, too intentional. It was not an accident. It was a chamber. Small, narrow, just large enough to hold something, but an effort to maintain the integrity of the object over time. But this was perhaps even authorization at some level, which means the decision to hide this folio was not impulsive. It was deliberate, and more importantly, it was considered necessary. Because hiding something like this does not just remove it from view, it removes it from access, from interpretation, from discovery. Unless, of course, something goes wrong. For centuries, nothing did. The wall remained intact. The chamber remained sealed. The folio remained exactly where it had been placed, untouched, unexamined, effectively erased from existence. And then slowly, almost imperceptibly, the structure began to fail. Not by design, not by intention, but by time. Time does not respect secrecy. It does not preserve intention. It breaks things down, weakens them, exposes them, regardless of what was meant to stay hidden. And in doing so, it creates openings, small at first, then larger, until eventually, something that was never meant to be seen becomes visible again. But what makes this discovery unsettling is not just the fact that the chamber existed, it is the part of the plan. And that leads to a realization that is difficult to ignore. This was not forgotten. It was hidden. At first, it looked like nothing more than a word. Just ink on parchment, one among many lines of text, positioned without decoration, without emphasis, without any immediate indication that it carried more weight than the rest. It did not stand out visually. It was not larger, not darker, not marked in any way that would suggest importance. And yet, it was repeated, not frequently enough to be obvious, but not rarely enough to be ignored. Some Britban, placed carefully, almost rhythmically, embedded within different sections of the text as if it served a purpose, beyond simple identification. Custodes. Latin, at least on the surface, offers clarity. It is a language of structure, of precision, of definitions that rarely leave room for ambiguity. Custodes translates directly to watchers, or more precisely, those who guard. those who observe, those who stand witness. It is not an unusual word in itself. It appears in religious texts, in legal contexts, in descriptions of roles and responsibilities within ecclesiastical hierarchies. If their presence required no explanation, as if whoever wrote this document expected the reader to already understand. That detail is easy to overlook, but it changes everything. Because it means this was not written for discovery. It was written for someone who already knew. And that implies the existence of something larger. A network. A shared understanding. A body of knowledge that extended beyond this single page. The Watchers were not introduced because they did not need to be. They were already known. That realization shifts the nature of the folio from isolated artifact to fragment of a system. Something incomplete, not because it was poorly preserved, but because it was never meant to stand alone in the first place. Which raises an immediate and unavoidable question. If this was only one piece, where are the others? The search for answers began where it always does. Records, archives, the structured memory of institutions. The Vatican maintains some of the most extensive archives in existence. A vast and meticulously organized collection of documents spanning centuries, preserving everything from theological debates to administrative records, from correspondence to internal reports. If an order like the Watchers had existed within the Church, even briefly, there should have been a trace, a mention, a reference, a name. There was nothing. No custode, no Watchers, no variation of the term associated with any monastic group, any scholarly circle, any faction, official or otherwise. The absence was absolute, which in itself is not unusual. History is full of gaps. Records are lost. Documents are destroyed. Names fade. But this did not feel like a gap. It felt like a removal. Because when something is forgotten, it leaves inconsistencies, partial references, contradictions, fragments that do not align. But here, there was nothing. Not even contradiction. Just a clean, uninterrupted surface where something should have been. That level of absence requires effort. It requires intention. It requires someone to know what needs to be removed, and to remove it thoroughly enough that no residual trace remains. And that brings the focus back to the word itself. Custodes. If it does not appear before in official records, then its presence here becomes even more significant, because it means this document is not just referencing something unknown. It is referencing something that was deliberately excluded from history. And yet, the word served, which suggests that whoever attempted to erase the Watchers did not succeed completely. Or perhaps they missed something. But there is another possibility, one that is far more unsettling, that the word was allowed to survive. Because a single word, without context, without structure, without supporting evidence, is not enough to reconstruct what it represents. It becomes ambiguous, open to interpretation, easy to dismiss. A fragment, harmless on its own, unless, of course, it is found alongside something else, something like this folio. Because now the word is no longer isolated. Now it is connected, anchored to content that should not exist, written in a form that contradicts its own timeline, hidden in a place designed to prevent its discovery. And suddenly, it is no longer harmless. The implications begin to expand. Because if the Watchers were real, and if they operated within the Church without appearing in any official record, then their existence was either unknown to the institution or deliberately concealed by it. The first possibility is difficult to accept. An organized group capable of producing knowledge like this, operating within monastic environments without detection, without oversight, without leaving any trace in an administrative system that recorded far less significant matters, would require a level of invisibility that borders on impossibility. Which leaves the second possibility, that they were known and removed, not just suppressed, not just condemned, but erased so completely that even the memory of them was stripped from the systems designed to preserve history. And yet, the word remains. Custodes, not as a record, not as a description, but as a signal, a trace of something that once existed, something that was not meant to be remembered. And now, with that word identified, with its absence from every official source confirmed, the nature of the investigation begins to change. Because this is no longer about understanding a document. It is about understanding a silence that was constructed, maintained, enforced. And once you recognize that silence for what it is, it becomes impossible to ignore what it implies. The watches were not lost to time. They were removed from it. At a certain point, the strangeness of the folio stops being about what it is and becomes about what it contains. Because the deeper the text is examined, the less it resembles anything that should have existed within a monastic setting, and the more it begins to resemble something else entirely. Not theology, not philosophy, not even early natural observation, in the way medieval scholars occasionally recorded the world around them. This was structured, measured, deliberate. It did not describe belief. It described process. The first section that draws attention appears deceptively simple, a series of notes referring to light. At a glance, it could be mistaken for symbolic language, the kind often found in religious writing, where light represents divinity, purity, or revelation. But that interpretation does not hold for long, because the language is wrong. There are references to angles, to surfaces, to direction, to something described not as illumination, but as behavior. The text speaks of light as if it moves according to rules that can be observed, predicted, and manipulated. It describes how light changes when it passes through different materials, how its intensity shifts depending on distance and obstruction, how its path can be altered using reflective surfaces positioned at precise orientations. There is no metaphor here, no spiritual framing. No suggestion that this is anything other than an attempt to understand how light operates in physical space. And then the detail deepens. There are passages that describe what can only be interpreted as controlled experiments, repeated observations, slight variations in setup, careful attention to outcomes. The text implies that the writer was not simply observing light in nature, but actively creating conditions in which its behavior could be studied. That alone is unusual. But what follows is something else entirely. There are references to convergence, to the focusing of light into a single point, to the increase of intensity when multiple sources are aligned, and then a line that stands apart from the rest. A description of heat, not from fire, not from flame, but from light itself. The implication is subtle but unmistakable. The writer is describing the use of focused light to generate heat strong enough to affect physical materials, to change them, to alter their state. This is not symbolic knowledge. This is functional. And it should not exist in this form, because understanding that light can be concentrated to produce heat requires not just observation, but experimentation, precision, and a conceptual framework that would not formally emerge until much later. And yet, here it is, not theorized, not speculated, but recorded. And this is only the beginning, because the text does not remain focused on light. It moves, gradually, almost seamlessly, into another domain. Sound. At first, the transition is easy to miss. The language shifts subtly, references to illumination giving way to descriptions of vibration, of movement through air, of patterns that cannot be seen, but can be felt. But the structure remains the same. Observation, variation, outcome. The writer describes sound not as music, not as something aesthetic or expressive, but as a physical force, something that exists independently of meaning, something that interacts with the human body in measurable ways. There are references to frequency, though not in modern terms, described instead as differences in tone that produce different effects. Some tones are described as calming, others as agitating, others as inducing a kind of stillness that is difficult to define, but clearly intentional. And then, once again, the detail deepens. There are descriptions of enclosed spaces, of chambers, of how sound behaves differently, depending on the shape and material of the environment in which it exists. The writer notes that certain architectural forms amplify sound, while others absorb it. That specific dimensions can produce resonance, causing sound to linger, to repeat, to build upon itself in ways that alter its effect on those who hear it. And then comes something that is difficult to dismiss as coincidence. A description of voice, not in terms of speech, but in terms of origin. There are passages that suggest the ability to project sound in such a way that its source becomes unclear. That a voice can appear to come from a place other than where it is produced. That through careful manipulation of space and structure, sound can be redirected. This is not music. This is control. Control of perception. Because if a voice can be heard but not located, if sound can surround without revealing its source, then it does not behave like something natural. It behaves like something other. And in a setting where belief shapes interpretation, that difference matters. Because what cannot be explained can be believed, and what is believed can be controlled. By this point, the pattern becomes clear. Light is not being studied for what it represents. Sound is not being explored for how it expresses. Both are being analyzed for how they influence. And that realization leads to the most unsettling section of the text, the part that does not focus on external phenomena, but on the human mind itself. The language here becomes more complex, more fragmented, as if the writer is approaching something that is more difficult to define. There are references to perception, to how reality is not experienced directly, but through interpretation, through the senses, through processes that can be influenced. The writer suggests that what a person sees, hears, and feels is not fixed. It is constructed, and if it is constructed, it can be altered. There are descriptions of environments designed to produce specific internal states, combinations of light and sound arranged in ways that evoke particular emotional responses, that guide attention, that create a sense of presence or absence, of awe, of fear, of something beyond ordinary experience. Not randomly, not incidentally, deliberately. The implication is impossible to ignore. The Watchers were not just studying the world, they were studying how the world is experienced, and more importantly, how that experience could be shaped. Because if you understand how perception works, if you can identify the mechanisms through which reality is processed, then you do not need to change reality itself. You only need to change how it is perceived. And that is where the true weight of the text begins to settle. Because this is no longer about isolated experiments. This is no longer about curiosity. This is about application. About the possibility that environments, structures, spaces could be designed, not just to exist, but to influence, to guide, to control. And in the context of the church, that possibility becomes something else entirely. Because places of worship are not neutral. They are built to inspire, to evoke, to shape belief. But what if that shaping was not entirely spiritual? What if it was engineered? What if the feelings people described as divine presence, as transcendence, as connection to something greater, were not solely the result of faith, but of carefully constructed sensory experience? That idea is not just controversial. It is dangerous because it shifts the foundation of belief from something sacred to something designed. And that is the kind of idea that does not survive. Not openly, not intact, It is the kind of idea that gets fragmented, reduced, hidden. And yet, even in fragments, it remains, embedded in a torn folio, written in ink that does not belong to its time, hidden inside a wall that was built to keep it from being found. Which brings us back to the question that has been forming, quietly, beneath every detail. If this is what survived, what was removed? At first, the discovery feels contained. An object, a location, a word, a set of ideas that should not exist together, but somehow do. It is tempting at this stage to treat it as an anomaly, something rare, but isolated, something that can be studied, cataloged, explained, and eventually placed back into the structure of known history without forcing that structure to change. But the more closely each detail is examined, the less that containment holds. But because the problem is not just what was found. It is what that finding implies. The folio should not exist. The chamber should not exist. The word should not exist. And yet all three do. And they are connected, not loosely, not coincidentally, deliberately. That is the point where curiosity, though, begins to give way to something else. Something quieter, more persistent, suspicion. Because when separate anomalies align this precisely, the possibility of accident begins to disappear. And what replaces it is intention. Someone wrote the folio. Someone chose the material. Someone used ink that did not belong to that time. Someone placed it inside a chamber that had to be constructed with care. Someone sealed that chamber in a way that ensured it would not be found. None of those actions happen without purpose. And once that purpose is acknowledged, the question changes. It is no longer just, what is this document? It becomes, who created it? And that question does not exist in isolation. Because creation is only one part of the sequence, there is also destruction. Because the folio is incomplete. Sections are missing, not lost to time. Not faded, not accidentally damaged, removed. Cleanly. Precisely. The edges of the missing portions are too deliberate, too controlled to be the result of decay. Entire passages have been cut away, not torn, not worn down, but extracted, as if someone knew exactly which parts of the text could not be allowed to remain. That kind of removal requires knowledge. You cannot selectively destroy information unless you understand it, which means that whoever altered this document was not acting blindly. They were not erasing something they did not comprehend. They were targeting something specific. And that raises a second question. Who understood this well enough to decide what needed to disappear? Because that level of precision suggests familiarity. Not with the object itself, but with the knowledge it contains. And that familiarity implies proximity. The Watchers were not operating in complete secrecy. Someone knew. Whether that knowledge was shared, discovered, or exposed does not yet matter. What matters is that at some point, the existence of this information became visible to someone with the authority or the ability to act on it. And they did act. Not by preserving, not by studying, but by removing. That decision is not neutral. It reflects judgment, a determination that what was written here was not just incorrect, but unacceptable. And that kind of judgment does not happen at random. It happens within systems, institutions, structures designed to define what is allowed to exist and what is not, which brings the focus inevitably back to the environment in which this folio was found. The church, because the Watchers, if they existed, did not operate outside of it. They operated within it, inside its walls, within its monasteries, among its scholars, and that creates a contradiction that cannot be easily resolved. How does a group capable of producing knowledge like this exist inside an institution that leaves no record of them? There are only two possibilities. They were invisible, or they were erased. The first possibility is difficult to sustain, because invisibility at that level requires not just secrecy, but complete isolation from every system of documentation, communication, and oversight. It requires that no one ever noticed, no one ever recorded, no one ever questioned. That is not how institutions function, especially not ones as structured, as documented, as controlled as the medieval church. Which leaves the second possibility. They were known, and then they were removed. Not just the people, the idea, the knowledge, the trace, everything. But even that removal was not perfect, because something survived. And survival, even in fragments, changes everything. Because it means the process of erasure failed. Not completely, but enough. Enough for the outline of something to remain. Enough for questions to begin forming. And once those questions begin, they do not stop, because every answer leads to another layer. If the watches were erased, who ordered it? If the document was altered, who had access to it? If the chamber was constructed, who approved it? These are not small actions. They require coordination, authority, resources, which suggests that whatever happened here was not the decision of a single individual acting in isolation. It was systemic, organized, intentional. And that realization introduces something more unsettling than the artifact itself. It introduces agency. Because now this is no longer about something that existed in the past and disappeared. It is about something that was actively removed by someone for a reason. And that reason has not been recorded, which is perhaps the most revealing detail of all. Because institutions record what they want remembered, and they erase what they do not. So the absence of explanation is not a lack of information. It is information. It tells you that whatever the watchers were doing, whatever they discovered, whatever they understood, was not just dangerous. It was unacceptable. And once that idea takes hold, once the possibility of deliberate erasure becomes unavoidable, the tone changes. Because this is no longer an investigation into the past. It is an encounter with something that was meant to stay hidden. And that raises a final question, not about what happened, but about what happens next. Because if this was hidden once, it can be hidden again. And if it was erased once, who is to say it cannot be erased completely? Up to this point, everything can still be explained. Not comfortably, not completely, but within the boundaries of possibility. An unusual artifact, a hidden chamber, a missing record. History is full of irregularities, of fragments that do not align perfectly, of discoveries that challenge what we think we know. It is possible, even now, to place this within that category, to treat it as an anomaly waiting to be understood. But something has shifted, not in the evidence, in the pattern. Because the more these pieces are examined together, the less they behave like isolated details. And the more they begin to resemble something structured, something arranged, something that was not left behind by accident but managed, controlled, guided toward disappearance. The folio was not lost, it was altered. The chamber was not incidental, it was constructed. The name was not forgotten, it was removed. And once that pattern is seen, it becomes impossible to return to the earlier assumption that this is simply an incomplete piece of history. This is not absence. This is intervention. There is a difference between something fading over time and something being deliberately taken apart. Fading leaves traces, inconsistencies, fragments that still point back to what once existed. But this is cleaner than that. Too clean. Because what remains is not random. It is selective. Just enough to suggest, not enough to prove. Just enough to disturb, not enough to resolve. And that balance is not natural. It is maintained, which leads to a realization that settles slowly, almost quietly, but once it arrives, it does not leave. Someone did not want this to be understood. Not partially, not eventually, at all. And yet, they did not destroy everything. They left fragments. Or perhaps they failed to remove them. Both possibilities are equally unsettling. Because if the fragments were left intentionally, then they serve a purpose we do not yet understand. And if they were left behind by mistake, then what we are seeing now is not the full extent of what once existed, but only the pieces that escaped removal. Either way, what we are looking at is incomplete, and incompleteness has a particular effect on the mind. It does not resolve. It lingers. It expands. Because the absence of information does not end inquiry. It amplifies it. And that is where the tone changes, because this is no longer about what is known. It is about what is missing, and missing things have weight. They shape perception. They influence interpretation. They create space for questions that cannot be answered with what is available. And those questions begin to move in a specific direction, not outward, but inward, toward intent, toward motive, toward the possibility that what we are seeing is not the result of time, but the result of decision. A decision to remove, to conceal, to prevent. And once that possibility is acknowledged, even quietly, even without certainty, the entire discovery begins to feel different, heavier, because it suggests that this was never meant to be found. Not by accident, not by effort, not at all. And that leads to the one conclusion that is impossible to avoid, no matter how carefully it is approached. This was not forgotten, it was hidden. And whatever hid it may still be closer than we think. If the Watchers existed, they did not begin as something forbidden. They began as something familiar. Not rebels, not heretics, not enemies of the church. They began as monks, men who lived within the same stone walls, followed the same rituals, spoke the same prayers, and devoted their lives to the same purpose that defined every monastic order of their time. They rose before dawn, moved through the silence of cold corridors, gathered in dimly lit chapels where candlelight flickered against stone, reciting words that had been spoken for generations without alteration. To anyone observing from the outside, there would have been nothing unusual about them, nothing that distinguished them from the others. And that is precisely what allowed them to exist, because the difference did not begin in what they did. It began in how they thought. There is a moment, subtle and almost invisible, where devotion becomes inquiry, where repetition gives way to curiosity, where the act of accepting truth begins to feel incomplete without understanding it. For most, that moment passes. It is suppressed, redirected, absorbed back into the structure of belief. But for some, it remains, and it grows. The Watchers were not trying to challenge God. They were trying to understand Him. That distinction matters, because in their view, there was no contradiction between faith and knowledge, no division between the sacred and the observable. They did not see the universe as something separate from a divine creation, but as its most direct expression. To study it was not an act of defiance. It was an act of devotion. This is where their path begins to diverge, quietly, almost imperceptibly. Because once you accept that the universe itself is a form of divine language, something structured, something governed by patterns and relationships that can be observed and understood, then ignorance is no longer neutral. It becomes a limitation. And to remove that limitation becomes a calling. For the Watchers, knowledge was not dangerous. It was sacred. Light was not just a symbol of God. It was something God had created with rules, with behavior, with consistency that could be studied. Sound was not just a medium for prayer. It was vibration movement, something that interacted with the body and the mind in ways that could be measured. The human experience itself was not simply spiritual. It was structured, and structure can be understood. This is the foundation of their belief. Not that they could replace faith, but that they could deepen it by removing uncertainty, by replacing blind acceptance with direct comprehension. Because if you truly understand how something works, you are no longer dependent on interpretation. You see it for what it is. And that idea, though subtle at first, carries consequences, because institutions built on interpretation do not easily accommodate understanding that exists, while they lost that outside their control. The Watchers did not reject doctrine. They moved beyond its necessity. Not openly, not aggressively, but inevitably. Because once knowledge begins to accumulate, once patterns begin to reveal themselves, once the mechanisms behind what was once considered mysterious start to become visible, the need for explanation through authority begins to diminish. And that shift is where tension begins. Not immediately, not visibly, but structurally. Because the church did not position itself as a barrier to truth. It positioned itself as the interpreter of it. And interpretation requires mediation. It requires distance. between the individual and the divine. The Watchers were closing that distance, not by rejecting God, but by attempting to understand creation directly. And in doing so, they were approaching something that had always been carefully controlled: access. Because if knowledge provides a direct path to understanding the structure of reality, then it also provides a path that does not pass through authority. And that is where the danger begins to take shape, not in what they believed, but in what their belief allowed. The Watchers were not forming an opposition, they were forming an alternative, a way of seeing the world that did not require permission, a way of understanding that could not be easily contained. And at first, that difference went unnoticed, because it was small, subtle, contained within thought, within private observation, within quiet discussions that did not yet challenge the surface of the institution that surrounded them. But ideas like this do not remain small. They expand, they connect, they begin to form systems. And once they do, they become visible, not as a threat, but as something unfamiliar, something that does not fit. And when something does not fit within a system designed for consistency, it draws attention. The Watchers did not begin as something forbidden. They became forbidden, slowly, inevitably, because the moment you believe that understanding the universe is a form of understanding God, you are no longer limited to what you are told. You begin to see for yourself. And once that happens, there is no returning to ignorance. At the core of the Watchers, there was no rebellion. There was a shift, not in what they believed, but in how they understood belief itself. For most within the church, truth was something received, passed down, preserved through scripture, interpreted through doctrine. It existed above the individual, beyond questioning, beyond alteration. To believe was to accept. But for the Watchers, truth was something else entirely. It was not given. It was revealed, and not through authority. Through observation. They did not reject scripture. They reinterpreted it, because if God is the creator of all things, then creation itself must carry meaning, not symbolic meaning, not metaphor, structure, order, pattern, and patterns can be read. This is where their belief begins to take a form that is both elegant and deeply unsettling. They believed that the universe was not just created by God. It was a language written by him. And like any language, it could be studied, decoded, understood. Light was not just illumination, it was information. Sound was not just expression, it was influence. And reality itself was not fixed. It was interpreted. That idea, once fully realized, changes everything. Because if reality is interpreted, then perception becomes the gateway to truth. And perception can be shaped. This is where knowledge becomes something more than curiosity. It becomes access. Because to understand how light behaves is to understand how vision works. To understand how sound resonates is to understand how emotion can be guided. To understand how the mind processes stimuli is to understand how experience itself is constructed. And if experience can be constructed, then so can belief. Not forced, not imposed, but guided, subtly.
Precisely.
Inevitably. For the Watchers, this was not manipulation. It was alignment. They believed that by understanding the mechanisms of reality, they were not distorting truth. They were revealing it in its purest form. Because if God created the world with structure, then to understand that structure is to move closer to him. Not through faith alone, but through comprehension. And that is where their philosophy crosses a line that cannot easily be uncrossed. Because once knowledge becomes a path to the divine, faith is no longer the only path. And when there are multiple paths, authority becomes unstable. The church did not claim that knowledge was inherently wrong, but it did define the boundaries of acceptable understanding. What could be explored? What could be interpreted? What could be taught? The Watchers ignored those boundaries. Not openly, not aggressively, but fundamentally. Because if truth is embedded in creation itself, then no institution can claim exclusive access to it. And that idea does not need to be spoken to be dangerous. It only needs to be practiced. The Watchers did not declare their philosophy. They lived it, in quiet observations, in controlled experiments, in the slow accumulation of understanding that was never meant to exist outside approved doctrine. And as that understanding grew, so did its implications. Because they were no longer just studying the world, they were beginning to understand how it worked. And once that understanding reaches a certain point, it does something irreversible. It removes mystery. Not completely, not entirely, but enough. Enough to shift the balance between belief and knowledge. Enough to suggest that what people experienced as divine presence might not be entirely beyond explanation. And that suggestion is where unease begins to take hold. Because if something that feels sacred can be explained, then what remains of the sacred? The Watchers did not see this as a loss. They saw it as clarity, because to them understanding did not diminish God. It revealed Him more directly, more precisely, more truthfully. But from another perspective, that same idea can feel like something else entirely. Not revelation, reduction. Because if the mechanisms behind spiritual experience can be identified, if the conditions that produce awe, fear, transcendence can be recreated, then the line between the divine and the constructed begins to blur. And once that line blurs, it becomes difficult to tell where belief ends and design begins. That is the point where their philosophy stops being purely intellectual and starts becoming dangerous, not because it denies God, but because it changes how God is accessed. And access is power. The Watchers believed they were moving closer to truth, but in doing so, they were also moving beyond control. And control, especially in systems built on belief, is never relinquished easily, because if knowledge can lead to enlightenment without mediation, then mediation becomes unnecessary. And if mediation becomes unnecessary, then authority begins to erode. Not suddenly, not visibly, but inevitably. The Watchers did not set out to dismantle anything, but their ideas, if allowed to spread, would have done exactly that. Not through force, but through understanding. And understanding, once achieved, cannot be undone. Knowledge on its own is not dangerous. It becomes dangerous when it begins to move, because an idea, no matter how radical, no matter how disruptive, remains contained as long as it exists in isolation. It can be dismissed, ignored, or forgotten, but once it is shared, once it begins to travel from one mind to another, once it forms connection, it becomes something else, a system, and systems are much harder to erase. The Watchers understood this. They have all understood that what they were studying, what they were beginning to uncover, could not be recorded openly, could not be preserved in any form that resembled traditional documentation. Anything too direct, too explicit, too visible would inevitably draw attention, and attention within the structure they existed in led to scrutiny, and scrutiny led to removal. So they adapted. They did not stop recording knowledge. They changed how it was hidden. Because concealment does not require absence. It requires misdirection. The most effective way to hide something is not to remove it, but to place it somewhere no one thinks to question. And within the church, there were many such places. Places that were seen, but not examined. Heard, but not analyzed. Repeated, but not understood. The first of these was language itself. Latin, the foundation of religious life. The language of prayer, scripture, and record was also a language of structure. Its precision made it ideal for theology, but that same precision made it capable of carrying something else entirely. The Watchers began to use it differently, not to express belief, but to encode information. At first, the shift is almost imperceptible. Slight alterations in phrasing, unusual sentence structures, words placed in positions that seem grammatically correct but contextually strange. To anyone reading casually, it would appear normal, indistinguishable from countless other texts produced in monastic environments. But to someone who knows what to look for, patterns begin to emerge. Certain words appear in sequences that do not align with their literal meaning. Certain phrases repeat in ways that suggest structure rather than emphasis. Certain sections, when isolated, reveal relationships that are not theological, but mathematical. This is not writing. This is coding. Information embedded within language, hidden beneath layers of meaning that protect it from being recognized by those who are not aware of its existence. But language alone is not enough. Because language can be read, analyzed, questioned. The Watchers needed something more stable, more pervasive, something that existed everywhere and was never suspected. Music, hymns, sung daily, repeated without variation, memorized, internalized, carried through generations without alteration. They were considered sacred, immutable, part of the ritual structure that defined monastic life. And that is exactly why they were perfect. Because no one questions what is repeated without change. The Watchers began to embed information within these hymns, not in the words themselves, but in the structure of the sound. Variations in tone, in interval, in sequence. Patterns that, when interpreted correctly, corresponded to relationships beyond music. Ratios, proportions, combinations. To the ear it remained devotional. But beneath that surface, it was something else. A system of transmission. Knowledge carried not through text, but through sound. Disguised as worship. Preserved through repetition. Passed from voice to voice, without ever being written in a form that could be easily identified or destroyed on. And then there was the architecture. Because walls do not speak, but they can carry meaning. Frescoes painted across ceilings and walls, filled with imagery that appears symbolic, decorative, religious in nature. Scenes from scripture, representations of saints, or turns that guide the eye upward towards something beyond. They are meant to inspire, but they can also conceal. The Watchers began to use these surfaces as maps, not of land, of the sky. Embedded within the arrangement of figures, within the placement of stars, within the geometry of shapes that appear purely ornamental, were patterns that corresponded to astronomical configurations. Alignments that, when viewed not as art but as data, revealed positions, relationships, movements. To anyone unaware, it was decoration. To those who understood, it was information, stable, visible, and yet completely hidden. Because no one expects a map to be painted as devotion, and no one searches for knowledge in something they already believe they understand. This is the brilliance of the system. It does not rely on secrecy in the traditional sense. It relies on assumption. The assumption that what is seen is what it appears to be. The assumption that what is heard is what it claims to represent. The assumption that structure exists only for the purpose it has been assigned. The Watchers built their communication within those assumptions. They hid knowledge in plain sight by placing it where no one would think to look. And in doing so, they created something remarkably resilient. Because you can burn a document. You can destroy a manuscript. You can erase a name from a record. But how do you erase a pattern embedded in architecture? How do you remove information carried through song? How do you eliminate something that does not appear to exist? You don't. Not completely. You remove what you can. You suppress what you find. You alter what is obvious. But the rest remains. Fragmented, disguised, waiting. And that is where the system becomes more than just a method of communication. It becomes a form of survival. Because even if the Watchers themselves were removed, their knowledge, if hidden well enough, could outlive them. Not intact, not whole, but present. And presence, even in fragments, is enough. Enough to be rediscovered, enough to be reassembled, enough to raise a question that grows more difficult to ignore. If this is how they hid what they knew, what exactly were they trying to protect? If you were to walk through the monastery during the day, you would see nothing unusual. That is the first rule of survival, to remain indistinguishable. The Watchers did not separate themselves from the others. They did not form visible groups, did not gather in ways that could be easily observed, did not behave in any manner that would draw attention. To anyone looking from the outside, they were simply part of the order. Men bound by the same vows, the same discipline, the same quiet rhythm of monastic life. They woke before dawn, not by choice, by ritual. The bell would echo through stone corridors, low and heavy, cutting through the last fragments of sleep. In the darkness, figures would rise, move silently, robes brushing against cold floors, footsteps measured, controlled, familiar. There was no urgency, no hesitation, only repetition. This had been done before. It would be done again. They gathered in the chapel, candlelight flickering against high walls, shadows stretching and shifting as voices began to rise in unison. Latin words spoken and sung, filling the space, layered, rhythmic, structured. To anyone listening, it was devotion. And for most, it was. But among them, there were those who heard something else. Patterns, intervals, relationships hidden within sound. The watchers did not sing differently. They listened differently. Every note carried information. Every variation, no matter how slight, mattered. The hymns were no longer just expressions of faith. They were sequences, structures that could be analyzed, remembered, interpreted. What others experienced as spiritual elevation, they experienced as data moving through space. And yet, nothing in their behavior revealed this. They knelt when others knelt. They bowed when others bowed. They followed every movement, every gesture, every expectation without deviation. Because visibility was risk. The day continued in cycles. Work, prayer, silence, tasks assigned without question. Copying manuscripts, tending to the grounds, maintaining the structure of the monastery itself. Simple, repetitive labor that required focus but not thought. Actions that filled time without inviting scrutiny. And during those hours, they remained still, not inactive, contained. Because what defined them was not what they did in the light. It was what they became in the dark. Night within the monastery is not empty. It is quieter, yes. Slower, more restrained. But it is not still. Because when the final prayers end, when the last candle is extinguished, when the corridors fall into silence and the structure of the day dissolves, something shifts. The watchers begin to move, not all at once, not together, one at a time. A door opens softly. Footsteps, barely audible, move through corridors now absent of witnesses. The same paths walked during the day take on a different quality. The familiar becoming concealed, the visible becoming obscured. They do not gather in obvious places. They use what is already there. A storage room, a forgotten corner, a space beneath the structure that serves no defined purpose. Locations that exist within the monastery, but are not part of its function.
And in those spaces?
They work. The transformation is not dramatic. There are no sudden changes in identity. No visible markers that distinguish them from what they were hours before. But the focus shifts. The same hands that copied scripture now adjust surfaces, angles, positions. The same eyes that followed lines of text now observe the behavior of light as it moves across a controlled space. The same voices that sang in unison now test tones in isolation, listening not for harmony, but for effect. This is where the watchers exist most fully, not in opposition to their daytime roles, but in extension of them. Because to them there is no division between faith and inquiry, only a difference in method. They experiment quietly, carefully, every action measured, every outcome observed. Light is directed, reflected, focused, not randomly, precisely. Sound is produced, contained, allowed to interact with the space around it, not for beauty, for response. And then the most difficult observations begin, the ones that cannot be seen directly. The effect on the self. They pay attention to how they feel, how perception shifts under certain conditions, how space, sound, and light combine to produce something internal, something difficult to describe, but impossible to ignore. This is not abstract, it is systematic. Because if a certain arrangement produces a consistent experience, then that experience is not accidental. It is reproducible. And if it is reproducible, it can be controlled. This is the point where their work moves beyond observation into application, because understandings is not their end. It is their tool, and tools are meant to be used. Hours pass unnoticed. Time behaves differently in these spaces, detached from the structure of the day. defined only by the progression of thought, by the gradual accumulation of insight. But eventually, it ends, because it has to. Before dawn, always before dawn, the Watchers return. The spaces they used are left unchanged. No marks, no evidence, no indication that anything occurred. They move back into the roles they never left. And when the bell rings again, they are already there. Indistinguishable, unremarkable, present, but unseen. This is how they survive, not by hiding from the system, but by existing within it, fully integrated, fully aligned, and yet completely separate. Because while others live within the rhythm of the monastery, the Watchers operate beneath it, in a layer that is never acknowledged, never recorded, never meant to exist. And that is what makes them so difficult to detect. Because nothing about their lives appears unusual until you realize that everything about them, there is always one. In every system, in every hidden order, in every structure that exists between obedience and discovery, there is always one who feels it more deeply than the others. Not because he is more intelligent, but because he hesitates, because he questions, because he feels the weight of what is happening. Before he understands it, he does not have a name in the records, but he exists. You can see him if you look closely enough. A young monk, not yet shaped completely by discipline, not yet hardened by repetition, still carrying something of the world he left behind. His movements are precise, but not automatic. His voice steady, but not empty. There is thought behind his silence. And that thought does not always resolve. He arrived as they all did, drawn by faith, by purpose, by the promise that within these walls he would find something greater than himself. And at first, he did. The structure comforted him. The certainty, the clarity, the absence of choice. Every hour defined, every action meaningful, every question already answered before it could fully form. It is a kind of peace until something interrupts it. Not suddenly, quietly. A moment during prayer where the words lose their solidity. A note in a hymn that feels different, not emotionally, but physically. A pattern in the way light falls across stone that lingers longer than it should. Small things, but small things accumulate, and eventually they begin to form a question. He notices them. At first, he tries not to, because noticing leads to thinking. And thinking in a place like this has limits. But the patterns do not stop. They repeat. Not perfectly, but consistently enough to suggest intention. And that is when he sees them. Not clearly, not directly, but differently. The others who move through the same spaces, but with a different awareness. They listen in ways that are too focused, observe in ways that are too precise. Their attention lingers where it should pass. Their stillness feels deliberate. He cannot explain it, but he recognizes it because he feels it too. And that is how it begins. Not with an invitation, but with recognition. A glance held slightly longer than necessary. A silence that feels shared. A presence that does not need to be acknowledged to be understood. They do not approach him. He moves closer, gradually, carefully, because something in him wants to know. And wanting to know is the first step. The first time he sees it clearly. It is not dramatic. There is no revelation, no moment of sudden clarity. Just a door, slightly open, a space not meant to be used at that hour. A light where there should be darkness. A sound that does not belong to prayer. He hesitates. That hesitation matters, because this is the point where choice exists. He can turn away, return to certainty, remain within the structure that has already defined his life. Or he can step forward, and once he steps forward, there is no return. He enters. The space is small, contained, unremarkable at first glance, but the air feels different, not spiritually, precisely. As if something within the space has been arranged. And then he sees it. Light. Not from a candle. Directed. Focused. Controlled in a way he has never seen before. And around it, the others, not praying. Working. Measuring. Observing. Adjusting. Their movements are calm. Confident. Familiar. As if this is not something new. but the something they have done many times before. He does not understand what he is seeing. Not yet. But he understands one thing immediately. This does not belong. Not in the monastery. Not in the structure he has accepted. Not in the world as he has been taught to see it. And yet, it exists. That contradiction settles into him. Slowly. Uncomfortably. Because if this exists, then something he believes must be incomplete. And that is where the real conflict begins. Not between him and them, but within himself. Because the Watchers do not force him. They do not explain. They do not persuade. They allow him to observe. And observation is enough. Because once he sees it, once he recognizes that what they are doing is not random, not chaotic, but structured, intentional, consistent, curiosity becomes something else. It becomes necessity. He begins to return, at first cautiously, watching more than participating, trying to understand without committing. But understanding demands involvement, and involvement changes him. Gradually, almost invisibly, he begins to notice patterns others ignore. He begins to hear differences others cannot detect. He begins to feel shifts in perception that he cannot explain but cannot deny. And with each new realization, the distance between what he was taught and what he experiences widens. Faith does not disappear. It fractures, because now it must coexist with something else. Something that does not contradict it directly, but reshapes it. And that reshaping is not comfortable. Because it removes certainty, it replaces answers with questions, and questions, once formed, do not disappear. He does not stop believing, but he begins to see belief differently, not as something to accept, but as something to understand. And that shift is irreversible, because once you see the structure beneath experience, once you recognize that what feels divine may also be constructed, you cannot return to not knowing. And that is the cost. Not punishment. Awareness. Because awareness changes everything. And for him, it has only just begun. At first, nothing happens. That is how systems maintain themselves. Not through immediate reaction. Not through sudden intervention. But through observation. Because deviation, when it is small, does not threaten structure. It is watched, measured, allowed to exist. For a time, the Watchers had been careful. Careful enough to remain invisible. Careful enough to integrate their work into the rhythm of the monastery. Careful enough that what they were doing could be mistaken for nothing at all. But precision has limits, and over time, patterns emerge, not in what they intended to reveal, but in what they could not completely conceal. It begins with the manuscripts, subtle inconsistencies, small deviations in structure. At first they appear insignificant, a phrase that does not align perfectly with accepted theological language, a sentence that feels slightly misdirected, words placed correctly, but meaning something else. To most this passes unnoticed, but not to everyone. Because within the church, there are those whose role is not to create, but to preserve, to ensure that what is written remains consistent, unaltered, aligned with doctrine, and consistency is fragile. It only takes one deviation to reveal a pattern. Then 2, then 3. And once a pattern is suspected, it begins to be examined carefully, quietly. Because suspicion at this stage is not accusation. It is attention. And attention changes everything. The hymns come next, not in their words, but in their sound.
A variation too precise to be accidental.
A repetition that does not follow tradition. An interval that produces an effect that feels different. Not wrong, but noticeable. And once noticed, it cannot be unheard. The experience shifts. What was once purely devotional begins to feel structured in another way. Not just emotional, intentional. And that intention raises questions. Because sacred music is not meant to be modified. Not in form, not in function. It is meant to remain constant. So when it changes, even slightly, it is not dismissed. It is remembered. And then, there is the architecture. This is where the pattern becomes impossible to ignore. Because stone does not change easily. It does not shift without cause. It does not align differently without design. And yet, there are spaces within the monastery that begin to feel unusual. Rooms where sound behaves differently. Corridors where voices seem to carry farther than they should. Chambers where silence feels too complete, not empty, controlled.
These are not dramatic anomalies.
They are subtle, but subtle does not mean invisible. Because when multiple anomalies begin to overlap, they stop being isolated. They form a system, and systems are recognized, not immediately, but inevitably. The church does not react impulsively. It observes, it gathers, it waits, because to act without certainty is to risk error. And error, at that level, carries consequences, so the response is slow, measured, deliberate. Records are reviewed, patterns are compared. Individuals are observed, not openly, never openly, because awareness would change behavior. And what is needed is truth, unaltered, unaware. The watchers do not see this happening, not at first, because their focus is inward, on their work, on their understanding, on the quiet expansion of knowledge that continues beneath the surface of everything else. But systems like this do not remain hidden forever. Eventually, something shifts. A glance that lingers too long. A question that is asked too carefully. A silence that feels intentional. The young monk feels it before he understands it. That is his nature. Noticing, sensing, recognizing change. Before it becomes visible, the spaces feel different. Not physically, socially. The rhythm of the monastery remains the same. The prayers continue. The routines do not change. But something beneath them tightens. Conversations become shorter. Observations become sharper. Presence becomes heavier. And with that shift comes awareness, not of what has been discovered, but of the possibility that something has. The watchers do not speak of it. They do not confirm. They do not speculate. But their behavior changes slightly, carefully, enough to suggest that they understand what is coming, because they always knew this moment would arrive. Not when, but that it would. Because knowledge like this does not remain unnoticed forever. And once it is noticed, it is no longer safe. The question is no longer whether they will be discovered. It is how much has already been seen. And that uncertainty is more dangerous than certainty itself. Because now, they are no longer working in isolation. They are being observed. And observation within a system that does not tolerate deviation is not passive. It is the beginning of intervention. The watchers are still there, still moving, still studying, still understanding. But something fundamental has changed. They are no longer hidden, not completely. And once something is no longer hidden, it begins to disappear. At first, it does not look like a revelation. It looks like architecture. Stone, arches, light passing through colored glass, sound rising and dissolving into vast empty space. Everything about it feels familiar, sacred, expected, because these structures were never meant to be questioned. They were meant to be experienced, and that distinction is where everything begins to change. Because once you stop looking at these spaces as places of worship and begin to observe them as systems, patterns begin to emerge, not symbolic patterns, functional ones. And once those patterns are seen, they cannot be unseen. The first realization is subtle, almost easy to dismiss. The way sound behaves inside these spots. Anyone who has stood inside a cathedral knows the feeling. A whisper carries farther than it should. A single voice expands, fills the entire structure, as if the space itself is amplifying it, shaping it, giving it presence beyond what seems physically possible. At first, this is attributed to scale, height, volume, open space. But scale alone does not explain precision. Because the way sound moves in these spaces is not random, it is controlled. Certain tones linger longer than others. Certain frequencies resonate, building upon themselves, creating layers that do not simply echo, but accumulate. This is not passive acoustics. This is design. The geometry of the structure, the curvature of the arches, the positioning of surfaces, all contribute to a system that does not just carry sound, but shapes it. And then the details deepen. Hidden within the architecture are elements that are not immediately visible. Channels, narrow passages embedded within walls, hollow spaces beneath floors, structures that do not serve structural support, but transmission. There are records, scattered and incomplete, of systems that allowed sound to travel through concealed pathways, emerging at points far removed from its source. A voice spoken in one location could be heard in another, not as an echo, but as if it originated there. Imagine that. A voice with no visible source. A sound that surrounds, that appears to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. In a space already designed to inspire belief, that effect is not neutral. It is transformative. Because what cannot be located cannot be questioned. And what cannot be questioned can be believed. This is where the idea begins to take shape. Not fully, not comfortably, but undeniably. What if these spaces were not just designed to carry sound, but to control how it is perceived? What if the voice of God was not always imagined, but engineered? The thought is unsettling, but it does not end there, because sound is only one part of the system. The second is light. At first glance, stained glass appears purely symbolic. Images, stories, colors arranged to inspire, to educate, to guide the eye towards something beyond. But light does not simply pass through these surfaces. It is filtered, altered, broken into components that behave differently, depending on their wavelength, their intensity, their angle of entry. The placement of these windows is not arbitrary. They are positioned with precision to capture light at specific times, at specific angles, to direct it into the space in ways that change throughout the day. Morning light is different from afternoon light, different from evening light, not just in brightness, in quality, in effect. Certain colors dominate at certain times. Certain areas of the structure are illuminated, while others remain in shadow. The result is not static. It is dynamic, a shifting environment that subtly alters perception, mood, and attention without the observer being fully aware of it. This is not decoration. This is modulation. Because light affects the mind, it influences emotion, focus, state of awareness. And when combined with sound, those effects do not simply add, they multiply. This is where the system becomes something else entirely. Because now, it is no longer about individual elements. It is about interaction. Sound shaping space, light shaping perception. Together, shaping experience. And experience is what belief is built on. The Watchers understood this. Not abstractly, practically. Because if you can create an environment that consistently produces a specific internal state, awe, fear, submission, then that state will be interpreted not as design, but as presence, as something external, something greater, something beyond. And once that interpretation takes hold, it reinforces itself. Because the experience feels real. And what feels real is rarely questioned. This is the point where the architecture stops being passive. It becomes active. Not just a space where belief occurs, but a system that shapes it. And then, the final layer reveals itself. The mechanisms, not obvious, not easily seen, but present. There are accounts, fragmented and incomplete, of metallic components, embedded within floors, structures beneath stone surfaces that carry properties not immediately visible. Copper, capable of conducting not just heat, but vibration. Materials positioned in ways that suggest purpose beyond construction. There are references to reflective surfaces, polished to a degree that allows light to be focused, redirected, concentrated, not symbolically, physically, and in certain conditions, intensified, enough to produce heat, enough to alter materials, enough to demonstrate that what appears intangible can be controlled. This is not speculation. It is implication. Because when multiple systems align, sound, light, structure, material, the result is not random. It is engineered, and that leads to a realization that is difficult to accept. Not because it is impossible, but because it changes too much. Because if these spaces were designed not just for worship, but for influence, then the experience of the sacred is no longer entirely beyond explanation. And that thought, once formed, does not leave. It lingers, quietly, persistently, because it raises a question that becomes harder to ignore with every detail. Not about what was built, but why. And once that question is asked, it leads to another, one that is far more unsettling. Was faith engineered? It does not happen all at once. Systems like this do not react with chaos. They respond with precision. Because when something is considered dangerous, truly dangerous, the goal is not to confront it. The goal is to remove it completely, not just the people. The idea, the trace, everything. The moment of discovery is never recorded. There is no single document, no clear line that marks the point at which the watchers were identified, no preserved account of who first recognized what they were doing or how far their knowledge had spread. But the pattern suggests something undeniable. At some point, they were seen, not fully, not completely, but enough to understand that what they were building could not be allowed to continue. Because this was not heresy in the traditional sense. It was not a rejection of God. It was something far more difficult to control. Knowledge. Knowledge that did not depend on authority. Knowledge that could be replicated, tested, expanded. Knowledge that could move. And once knowledge begins to move, it cannot be contained by belief alone. That is when the label appears, quietly, not announced, assigned, heresy, not because it denies doctrine, but because it bypasses it. And alongside it, another classification, more subtle, more precise, dangerous knowledge, not false, dangerous. That distinction matters. Because false ideas can be debated, corrected, refuted. Dangerous ideas are removed. The response is not immediate. It is organized, measured, because erasing something like this requires more than force. It requires understanding. You cannot remove what you do not first identify. And so, the process begins. Quietly, records are examined, manuscripts reviewed, patterns traced, names observed, not accused, not yet. Because accusation creates reaction, and reaction creates resistance. What is needed is silence, controlled, total. The watchers do not vanish in a single moment. They disappear in stages, one by one. A transfer, a reassignment, a quiet removal from the structure they once moved through unnoticed. No announcement, no explanation, just absence. And absence at first can be explained until it accumulates, until too many names are no longer present, until too many spaces are left unoccupied, until something that once existed no longer does. And by the time that realization begins to form, it is already too late. Because the second phase has begun, the erasure of record. This is where the precision becomes visible. Documents are not destroyed randomly. They are selected carefully. Pages removed. Sections altered. References rewritten. Not everything is burned. That would leave evidence. Instead, it is edited, adjusted, realigned with what is acceptable. Names disappear, not crossed out, not marked, simply no longer present. Entries that once existed are replaced with ones that never did. Timelines shift, subtly, enough to remove inconsistencies, enough to ensure continuity, enough to make it seem as if nothing had ever been there to begin with. This is not destruction. This is reconstruction. History is not erased. It is rewritten. And rewritten history is far more stable than absence, because it gives the illusion of completeness, the illusion that nothing is missing, that everything has been accounted for. And once that illusion is in place, it becomes self-sustaining, because future records build on past records. And if the past has been altered, then everything that follows inherits that alteration. This is how something disappears, not by being removed, but by being replaced. The final stage is silence, not enforced through fear, but through absence. Because by this point,
There is nothing left to speak of.
no names, no documents, no references, no trials, and that detail is perhaps the most unsettling of all.
Because there are no records of accusation.
No records of judgment, no records of execution, nothing. No evidence that the Watchers were ever officially condemned, no evidence that they were ever formally acknowledged. It is as if they passed through history without leaving a mark, and then ceased to exist completely. This is not how heresy is usually handled. Heresy is documented, recorded, public, because it serves as warning, as example, as reinforcement of authority. But this is different. There is no warning, no example, no trace, which suggests something far more deliberate. They were not meant to be remembered, not even as a mistake, because remembering them, even in condemnation, would require acknowledging that they existed. And that was not acceptable. So instead of destroying them publicly, they were removed quietly, completely, not just from the present, but from the past, unmade. That is the darkest implication. Not that they were killed, but that they were undone, that their existence was systematically dismantled, until nothing remained that could point back to them. Except, not quite nothing. Because erasure is never perfect. There are always fragments, things that do not align, details that remain. The architecture, still standing, still behaving in ways that are too precise to be accidental. The symbols, embedded in places where meaning should not exist. The patterns, repeating quietly beneath the surface of what appears to be ordinary. And then, the figures, the Black Madonnas, darkened forms that have long been explained away as the result of time, of smoke, of age. But what if they were not altered, but designed? What if their darkness was not decay, but intention? Another layer, another fragment, another trace of something that was never fully removed. And that is where the story does not end. Because absence does not mean nothing remains. It means what remains
It's harder to see.
The Watchers are gone. That much is clear. Removed from record, removed from history, removed from memory. But their work did not disappear completely. It lingers in structures, in patterns, in questions that refuse to resolve, and in a realization that settles slowly but does not leave. They were not just silenced, they were erased. And yet, something of them survived. Erasure is never absolute. It feels that way. Complete, clean, final, as if something has been removed so thoroughly that it leaves no trace, no residue, no indication that it was ever there at all. But that is an illusion. Because removal does not destroy structure. It only obscures it. And structure has a way of remaining, even when everything built upon it has been taken apart. The Watchers are gone. That much is certain. There are no names to follow, no documents to reconstruct, no lineage to trace. They do not exist in any form that history recognizes. And yet, the world they moved through has not changed. The cathedrals still stand, stone, silent, unquestioned. Their arches still curve with the same precision. Their chambers still hold sound in ways that feel unnatural. Their windows still shape light into something more than illumination. None of that was removed, because it could not be. You can erase a name, but you cannot erase a structure that continues to function. And that is where the legacy begins to reveal itself. Not as something obvious, but as something embedded, something that exists beneath interpretation. The Black Madonnas remain. Darkened figures, long explained as the result of time, of smoke, of centuries of exposure to candlelight and ritual. Their surfaces absorb light rather than reflect it. Their presence heavier, more grounded, more difficult to define. They have always been treated as anomalies. Accepted, but not fully understood. And what if they were never meant to be understood at a glance? What if their surface is not damage, but design? There are traces of metallic composition beneath the layers. Indications that the material itself behaves differently under certain conditions. that it interacts with light in ways that are not immediately visible. Not decoration, information. Encoded, just as the frescoes carried patterns that resembled maps, just as the hymns carried structures that resembled systems. These figures may carry something else entirely. Something that has not yet been fully recognized, because recognition requires context, and context was removed. That is the true effect of erasure. Not just the loss of information, but the loss of the ability to interpret what remains. Fragments without meaning, signals without reference, structures without explanation. And yet, they persist, quietly, waiting, because knowledge does not disappear. It changes form. It becomes harder to see, harder to recognize, but not impossible.
The question is not whether the Watchers succeeded.
It is whether what they understood still exists, because if their knowledge was embedded, hidden in systems that were never fully dismantled, then it may still be here, not intact, but present, in the way space feels inside certain structures, in the way sound behaves in places that were never meant to be questioned, in the way light alters perception without being noticed. Small things, subtle things, but consistent, and consistency is never accidental. This is where the story stops being about the past. Because if something remains, then it has not ended. It has only changed. And that leads to a question that is far more difficult to answer than anything that came before. Not who the Watchers were, not what they discovered, but whether we are already living inside what they built. Because if environments can shape perception, and perception shapes belief, then belief itself may not be as independent as it feels. And if that is true, then the line between faith and design is thinner than we think. The Watchers sought understanding, not control, but understanding can be used by those who find it, by those who inherit it, by those who recognize what others overlook. And that possibility is what remains, not as proof, but as presence, a quiet suggestion that something was once known and never fully lost. Because the most dangerous knowledge is not the kind that is hidden. It is the kind that survives without being recognized. And somewhere, in the spaces we do not question, in the structures we do not examine, in the experiences we accept without understanding, that knowledge may still exist, waiting, not to be discovered, but to be remembered. And when it is, the question will not be what was hidden, but why, and whether we were ever meant to find it at all.